In 1815, all the heads of European states gathered together in Vienna, the glorious Habsburg capital, for this historic occasion, the Congress of Vienna. And this was to celebrate the fall of Napoleon and the redrawing of the map of Europe, which had been devastated by the Napoleonic Wars, of course. Now, Beethoven was by then hailed as the most important composer, not only in Vienna, but also in Europe. And his music was being performed for all the dignitaries at the Congress in the celebrations and so on, including his groundbreaking and revolutionary Seventh Symphony, his Wellington's Victory Symphony, and his cantata, The Glorious Moment. But Beethoven's personal life painted quite a different picture. Again, the aging composer had only recently given up performing as a pianist in public due to his debilitating deafness. Now, a friend and colleague and a composer, Louis Spohr, gives an account of Beethoven performing, or rather not performing, rehearsing at his house, one of his new piano trios, with a couple of other musicians. And Louis Spohr writes this: "At the time I made Beethoven's acquaintance, he had already discontinued playing in public and at private parties. I had therefore one opportunity to hear him when I casually came round to a rehearsal of his new piano trio. It was by no means an enjoyment, for in the first place the piano was woefully out of tune, which, however, troubled Beethoven little, since he could hear nothing of it. And secondly, of the former so admired excellence of the virtuoso, scarcely anything was left, in consequence of his total deafness. In the forte passages, the poor deaf man hammered in such a way upon the keys that entire groups of notes were inaudible. I felt moved with the deepest sorrow at so hard a destiny. It is a sad misfortune for anyone to be deaf, but how then should a musician endure it without despair?" Beethoven's almost continual melancholy was no longer a riddle to me now. It's very sad, incredibly sad. Apart from his deafness, he was suffering from all sorts of other complaints increasingly. He'd become more eccentric. He was turning into himself in his own little world, becoming known for his shabby and very uncared for appearance and his unpredictable temperament. You wouldn't like to meet him on a dark night. Anyway, another report by another visitor to his apartment tells of the sheer squalor that he lived in. Wait for it. "Picture to yourself the dirtiest, most disorderly place imaginable. Blotches of moisture covered the ceiling. An oldish grand piano on which dust disputed the place with various pieces of engraved and manuscript music. Under the piano, I do not exaggerate, an unemptied pot de nuit. The chairs, mostly cane-seated, were covered with plates bearing the remains of last night's supper, and with wearing apparel, etc. Anyone with teenagers will know what that's like. Added to this, Beethoven was known to move apartments, not just frequently, but repeatedly. In the 35 years he lived in Vienna, he moved over 60 times, partly due to his restless nature, but partly due to his appalling domestic habits, which made him very unpopular with his neighbours. An account by his one-time secretary, Anton Schindler, who wrote one of the very early biographies of Beethoven, writes this: "Washing and bathing were among the most indispensable necessities of life for Beethoven. If, while he was working, he did not go out during the forenoon, in order to compose himself, he would stand at the wash basin. often in extremist negligee, and pour great pitchers full of water over his hands. At the same time, howling, or for a change, growling out the whole gamut of the scale, ascending and descending. Then, before long, he would pace the room, his eyes rolling or fixed in a stare, jot down a few notes, and again return to his water pouring and howling. These were moments of profoundest meditation, nothing worth making a fuss about had they not resulted in disagreeable consequences in two directions. In the first place, they often incited his servants to laughter, observing which the master would fly into a rage, on which occasion led him to deal ridiculous outbreaks. Or he would get into a fight with the landlord when the water leaked through the floor, which unfortunately often happened. This is the principal reason why Beethoven was everywhere unwelcome as a lodger. I'm going to finish with a performance of Beethoven's sonata in A-flat major, opus 110. This is the penultimate sonata, which was composed in 1821, at the same time that he was composing the Missa Solemnis and the Ninth Symphony, as if he had time for this as well, my goodness. Now, for me, this work epitomizes, or rather contains, everything, every aspect of Beethoven's creative personality. It's relatively short. It's a relatively short piece. It's only about 20 minutes. But it does take us through a whole range of human emotion, from the utmost desolation to the joy of victory and triumph and everything in between. All three movements are very intricately connected, and there is hardly a break between them. And as you see from the next slide, I have written some notes, or rather Beethoven wrote those, but I have copied them. And this is the main motive that he uses as a central pivot for the whole piece. And we hear that in its pure form, if you like, in the last movement, the third movement, the first time that the fugue appears. Now you notice that it's a rising figure. It goes up, down and up further, down and up further. So it's a symbol of hope, really. It's something positive, something, we're looking forward to something hopeful and positive. And in the first movement, well, first of all, in the last movement, the third movement, is a very unusual movement because he's using all these Baroque forms. But in the first movement, we have a very gentle and singing and very sort of tender atmosphere and character to this movement. To me, this feels like some sort of vision of something beautiful and heavenly that's far off, a sort of far-off place. But what he does in the very beginning, he actually shows us this theme. There is the fugue theme. So it's woven in very much part of the texture. It's a hopeful theme. The second movement, we come down to earth with a huge crash, because this is a very earthy movement. This shows us Beethoven's raucous humour. He uses two German folk songs, which is Our Cat Had Kittens, and the other one is I'm a slob and so are you. And he uses this, he uses these in the first part, and then we have a playful middle section, and then the two themes come back. But my goodness, what a change next. The third movement, we go into an unknown territory of desolation. A recitative is something we associate with opera. It's a half-spoken, perhaps timeless aspect to the music. And he imitates this in his piano writing. It seems to be wandering through the darkness aimlessly until the aria. Now, an aria is also a Baroque form, but it's a song, of course, and it goes like this. It's quite similar, I must say, to the second movement, which is a world away in its character. But also, we know that he loved the music of Bach and was making a particular study of Bach and Handel. So the St. John Passion by Bach contains the aria near the end, Es ist vollbracht. It is accomplished. And this describes Christ, his last words, as he dies in agony on the cross. Very similar. The aria ends almost as if that's the end. Despair. And then the fugue appears. Hope. And that builds and builds until we reach a triumphant end. And then no, we are going back into desolation. And the aria comes back again, this time even more desolate, in a lower, flatter key. And Beethoven actually writes on this, Klagende Gesang. Well, no, he writes that on the first one, but he writes ermattet, which means exhausted. I mean, this is the lowest depth that he is reaching, which I'm sure he did in his personal life. And just as we think all is lost again, we get to some major chords. Which get louder and louder, and then slipping in, almost unnoticed, in the back door, we get the fugue again. But this time, it's not as obvious because it's inverted. It's turned upside down. And the vitality grows. He literally says on the score, more and more new life. And so it builds and builds until the main fugal theme rings out. And joy and triumph at the end of the piece.